All right, my friends. So I think we will go ahead and get started with today's lecture. Today we have two lecturers coming with us. The first one is Ms. Meganne Drake. Meganne Drake graduated from UCLA with a bachelor's in archaeology and is a recent graduate from the University of Leicester. Hope I said that right, Megan. in the UK with a master's degree in museum studies. She started her museum career as a volunteer in 2006 at the La Brea Tar Pits in Los Angeles. There, she spent 5 years in the paleontology lab, focusing on a Columbian mammoth unearthed from the Project 23 site, an excavation site that resulted from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art's expansion. Ms. Drake then served as a gallery educator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in 2015, followed by a position as a lead gallery educator at the Natural History Museum in 2018. And then in 2019, she joined the Getty, where she oversees key components of the docent program, in addition to providing engagement sessions for the docent program as well, and some great ones, might I add. We also have Mr. Eric Bruehl, and Mr. Bruehl graduated from the University of Michigan with a bachelor's in classic archaeology and a master's in archaeology from UCLA. He took a part-time job translating German documents and providing interpretation for visiting scholars at the Getty Conservation Institute during his graduate career, which eventually led him to the education department at the Getty Villa. There, Mr. Bruehl's love and knowledge for Greco-Roman antiquities afforded him the opportunity to work with the public to better understand the Getty's antiquity collection, and more importantly, led to his work training and overseeing docent volunteers at the museum. And as a Getty gallery docent, I might add, these are two stellar, wonderful people that it's been a privilege for me to work with. So Eric and Megan, welcome.
Thank you, Ava Marie.
Thank you so much.
And so I believe, Eric, we're going to be hearing from you first.
Yes, that's correct. I'll kick it
All
off.
right, excellent. Well, take it away, and then welcome and thank you again for joining us today.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here among all of you. I have great respect for Emeritus students, not unlike docents, and maybe some of you are volunteer docents somewhere or volunteers. Emeritus students are lifelong learners, and that is something that can only be applauded and celebrated. Thank you very much for being here today. I hope Megan and I, provide a little bit of information, a lot of entertainment, and some interesting things you might not have seen. So I've set the bar for us, Megan. There we go.
Too high.
I am going to start sharing my screen here, and give me just a second to find it. Here it. Let me see. That's the one I want, I think. Are you seeing that in presenter mode or?
Yes, in presenter mode.
Let me try something else here. Hold on. Let's do that, and
I think you might be able to switch down by the three dots, perhaps, or you change the monitor.
yeah, I'm sorry. Hold on a second. Let me just.
There we go. You're all set.
Yes, unfortunately. Well, maybe let me just see something here.
Sure.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't see my notes. Let me just try one more thing here.
Sure, no problem. Students in my class know that this happens to me. I mean, technology is great. However, when we want it to work, it's very finicky.
No, that's not it. Well, that's all right. I have my notes in front of me. It's not going to be, it shouldn't be too difficult then just to go from there. So I wanted to say, yeah, again, welcome. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. Just a little bit about myself and about this presentation. The title, Digging Around, might sound a little informal, and indeed it was meant to. Megan and I are going to be talking about aspects of archaeology, including excavation, survey, and conservation. So digging around felt like a pretty good title. And ultimately, it's been a while since both Megan and I have been in the field. So when we were looking for information and images to share, it literally required some digging around to find that stuff. And especially for me, who's a bit older and was working in a time shortly before digital photography, the process of scanning scanning old photographs and digitizing them was a reminder of how far we've come. To get started, as Ava Marie said, my name is Eric Bruehl. I'm originally from Michigan. I grew up in a German and Peruvian household. My mother's side of the family is from Peru and my dad's from Germany, which meant that we were traveling over the summers to visit family very often. And that was something that really stuck with me, and the idea of traveling was something that had really fascinated me. So when I started college, I was fully intent on majoring in history to kind of, to explore other parts of the world that way. And one day when I was talking to a grad student, they suggested to me, why don't you go into archaeology? That way you don't have to spend your summers bored reading books in the library. That sounded like a good idea. The Romans had always fascinated me as a teenager, especially Julius Caesar, pictured here. So I drifted towards classical archaeology my sophomore year, and by the junior year, the summer of my junior year, I went to my first archaeological field school. And it's safe to say that summer basically directed the next 15 years of my life. So I'm going to take you on an odyssey, if you will, not unlike Homer's Odyssey, because it is also meandering and wandering without any kind of final destination or seeming final destination. But I did want to show what some of the projects that I had worked on over time looked like and what it was we were looking for. And to give some kind of justification as to why I was in the Mediterranean to begin with, other than just, there for the sun. Ultimately, my first project, one of the things I immediately realized was that if you are an undergrad student and you join a field project, you are in essence a laborer paying for the opportunity to work for your university. Nevertheless, that cost is somewhat offset, obviously, by the fact that you get to spend your summers somewhere in the Mediterranean. So let's take a look here. Like I said, Rome was my specialty, but I was actually more interested in the provinces and colonies outside of Rome, which is why I never excavated in Italy proper, but in other areas of the Mediterranean. And that first field school that I previously mentioned was a University of Michigan product focused on the ancient site of Leptis Minor. Oops, sorry. Oop, there it is. Yeah. Leptis Minor, which you see here at the, I'm going to use, hopefully you can see my my mouse down here on the bottom right. Leptis Minor, a town well known in antiquity as an olive growing center. And indeed, it was said that Caesar spent a night there prior to his battle against the allies of Pompey who opposed him. And the name might sound a little bit familiar. There's a cousin of Leptis Minor, Leptis Magna in Libya, which is probably the most well-preserved Roman town in existence at this point. So Leptis Minor is located near the modern town of, the modern town of Lamta on the east coast of Tunisia. And it was a thriving trading town next to a thriving trading town during its existence. It's right next to a harbor, which makes for an easy trade route. And it actually existed for about a 1200-year time period from 500 BC to 700 AD. The excavations actually pursued information for the final 300 years of its existence. That's what we were interested in from the period of the 4th century on. Time, however, has now reclaimed many of those ruins. And here you see the ancient amphitheater, hardly recognizable outside of the fact that it is a natural bowl depression. And the ancient city walls, over 2,000 years old, that you can see have fallen into disrepair, have been reclaimed, and have oftentimes been reused in other buildings. So the town of Leptis Minor had all of the amenities that you would expect of a thriving Mediterranean town: theaters, one of the largest bathhouses in North Africa, circuses, a forum, and other important structures. And those olive trees that really help form the backbone here of this town's economy are still rampant throughout the site. So this project, like I mentioned, was a field school, which means that it was part survey, part excavation, and part find analysis, 2 weeks each. So one's natural inclination is to think that excavation is really the most important part of any archaeological project. But each of these skills, survey, excavation, and analysis, are equally important. And what I mean by survey, if you take a field like the one we're looking at here with all of the olive trees, and teams of anywhere from 5 to 10 people, depending on the size of the area that you're walking, you literally just line up next to each other, spaced apart by about 6 feet, and you move in unison across a field, literally scanning the ground for anything that might look ancient. And survey is an important component, not only for recognizing exactly where sites might be located or where it might be pertinent to investigate further, but also for really tracking assemblages and their density. It's really with survey that you can see where much of the activity in antiquity that has come to the top happened. So excavation clearly then takes place when there's a markedly high number of finds in a concentrated area. And the results of our survey determined where we excavated. Of course, some luck is sometimes involved in that, but we were very fortunate that year. So our work actually consisted of excavating a small villa. And because we were a beginning field school and this excavation team was actually fairly small, this is primarily all we got to was a mosaic floor. But it's an important floor because although I wasn't involved in excavating or removing, I should say, the dirt from this floor, what I was responsible for was investigating this corner over here, and it's no longer really that visible, which showed evidence of pipes coming into and out of the villa. That's an important feature to note because these 2nd, 3rd century villas oftentimes had running water, exactly like we do today, regular plumbing, basically. And that pipe that we discovered in that corner and that we then unearthed proved to be the evidence we needed that this villa itself was in all likelihood hooked up to the local aqueduct and certainly had running water within the domicile. A funny story about this: one of the workmen and I were working. We were the ones who uncovered the ceramic pipe. And at a certain point, obviously, when you've uncovered an object, you need to photograph it, draw it, etc. And so we called the photographer and artist over, and they drew and photographed it. And as they finished up and left, we were laughing and high-fiving one another for having found something so important when the workman accidentally stepped on the ceramic pipe and broke it into 1,000 pieces. And for beginning archaeologists like myself, and for this poor workman, we thought we were in so much trouble. But when we told the director what had happened, the director asked, "Did you photograph it?" We said yes. The director asked, "Did you draw it?" We said yes. And she said, "Well, that doesn't matter anymore," and turned away. And that is an important reminder, I think, archaeology, we're going to be talking about conservation and restoration, or Meganne is a little bit later. But it's important to remember that while archaeology is bringing things to light and to the surface, it is really destruction more than anything else, because remember, a lot of the sites that we're going to look at today have been built upon by later generations. And in order to get to that, say, Roman era site or that Hellenistic period site, you have to go through many, many layers of settlement, previous settlement that came later. And you're smashing those layers up and basically erasing them from the record. So I think it's just an important point to point out that even while we're making these fantastic discoveries, we're also erasing some evidence. So my second year of excavation was a 6-week-long dig in Carthage, the seat of Roman power in Africa. It's a city with a legendary Phoenician Punic history of its own. And this excavation, under the auspices of the University of Georgia, focused on a densely populated cemetery located outside of the northwest walls of the city. And Carthage is here, pokes out right into the Mediterranean here in northern Africa. It's literally just a boat ride to Sicily from there, or to Italy too. And this necropolis, the cemetery we'll be talking about, is right here, the Yasmina necropolis, which you can see stands outside of the city walls of Carthage, which would have been appropriate for ancient cemeteries, which were 99.9% of the time located outside of the city walls. And you'll notice some of the other elements located near but not outside the city walls. The circus, the amphitheater, the theater and Odeon over here, as well as the bathhouse. And you'll notice these are somewhat not as marginalized as the cemetery, but also up against the walls on the outer parts of Carthage. It's those areas that are considered, perhaps in the case of the amphitheater and the circus, as rowdier, likely to attract a lower class of fan, in this case, that are held over, or that are kept by the walls. And the same goes for cemeteries. Cemeteries were thought to be somewhat unclean, and therefore the city of the dead belonged outside the city of the living. So this cemetery was fascinating, and actually it's because of the excavation here, my time here, that most of my research after this turned to cemeteries, Roman cemeteries specifically. And this cemetery was discovered purely by accident when a bulldozer preparing for a construction job or a construction project uncovered by accident the largest structure in this cemetery, this huge ashlar block tomb that you see in front of you, which is missing its roof, but in all other instances in fairly good condition. And as if there really needed to be further evidence that this cemetery was being used by individuals with money, outside of the tomb were found these two impressive 3rd century AD figural sculptures of a charioteer on the right there, and his wife that now reside in the National Museum at Carthage. It's been identified, or he's been, I should say, identified as a charioteer because he wears the belt typical of charioteers. That's the kind of strap around his midsection around which he would have wrapped the reins. And he holds a whip as well in his left hand. But in his right hand, he holds a tiny amphora, which some scholars have interpreted to indicate that he is instead a kind of trainer, if you will, known as the Sparsaurus. Someone who throws water on the horses, on their heads, in order to cool them off, and kind of takes care of them between races. At any rate, it's someone indicative of wealth, obviously, because of the sculpture, and probably higher status. The cemetery certainly displayed tendencies that are, aristocratic tendencies, so to speak, that are visible from these pictures. The large scale structures, primarily the tombs, the mausolea, built by aristocratic families, were built to accommodate both cremation burials and inhumation burials. And you can see here in this monument here, some of the niches that were used that were used for cremation urns. This has had some damage, but you can still see those holes there. Some of the burials were not mausolea or tombs, but rather these type of large memorials that were in effect structures located on the surface of the cemetery and with cremation urns that were buried beneath them. And these cremation urns were often tied to the monument via a ceramic tube. And actually, we found a wonderful example, ancient example that you can see right here. You see the lid to the ceramic urn that would have been the cremation burial. And then you see here that tube that would have extended from the monument down to the urn, and at which the families would have been expected to pour libations, to pour water, to pour, ritual perfumes, oils. The idea being, the idea being that you were honoring the dead, feeding the dead. I mean, it's very common in ancient funerary practice and mortuary practice to engage in feasting at the tomb and eating at the tomb. Families oftentimes during religious holidays, and while using a Roman example, while the Romans didn't practice the 5-day work week, didn't have weekends, so theoretically or technically never had a day off. They did have something like 180 some religious holidays a year, which allowed them to take plenty of time off. And many of those holidays were spent in the cemetery honoring the ancestral dead, and also picnicking and engaging with your family there in its entirety. Let me see here. There were, however, also beyond these kind of monuments, mausolea, and tombs, there were also inhumation graves, or what we would consider proper burials in the ground. And they do seem to indicate a different status from those who were interred in the tombs and mausolea. One fascinating burial, and I apologize here, remember this is a camera from 1998 taking this picture. This one fascinating burial was one of the first graves that I excavated, and it contained the body of a young girl between 10 and 15 years old. Unfortunately, I don't have an image of that because my director wouldn't allow me to photograph it at the time. But this young girl who had been buried directly outside of this major tomb with the doorway, she had been buried directly outside of it in the ground. 10 to 15 years old, and she was found a fully articulated skeleton with only one grave good, a pair of earrings that had dropped out of her ears, obviously when her earlobes had disappeared, when her skin had decomposed, that's the word I'm looking for. The earrings had dropped off of her ears and were lying behind her head when we excavated her. It was somehow a really poignant moment to see these grave goods, the only grave goods that this young girl had taken with her. But what was also fascinating is in her burial was also included a small Maltese dog, approximately 15 to 18 years of age. And you can see some of the bones. The trowel there is used for scale and also to point to some of the bones that were recovered. And you can see kind of the impression of the dog in the soil there and in the stone. Like I said, it lived to be approximately, we were able to age it, so it lived to be approximately 15 to 18 years of age. Anybody who owns dogs knows, even for a little dog, that's a pretty good length of lifetime. And it does seem as though, the lifetime took an effect on the dog. It only had a total of 3 teeth, sadly, in the lower jaw, which you see on the left there. And in the skull, in the upper jaw on the right, it was missing all of its teeth. And as a matter of fact, it had been missing its teeth for so long on the top part of the jaw that the bone had actually closed over, the tooth sockets by that point. And then underneath, you see the pelvis bone. The pelvis bone on the left is a healthy dog's pelvis bone. The pelvis on the right is this Maltese dog's pelvis. And you'll notice on the left, there is the socket for the ball and socket joint into which the femur would connect. That's what a healthy pelvis would look like. On the right, this poor animal at some point in time dislocated its right leg from the original socket and basically spent the rest of its lifetime kind of hobbling about and ultimately digging a new socket into its pelvis, because you can see there the difference between the two pelvises. The one on the right has two sockets where after the dislocation, this poor little dog further created another socket for its femur. In all likelihood, the zoologist who did this study on the dog suggested that this dog probably, for the most part, for most of its lifetime, limped around on 3 legs. So this, and here is a skeleton of that dog, fully articulated, and you can see, it's in remarkable condition. The excavation suggested that it was included in the girl's grave after her death, and whether that was her pet, parent's pet, that they just wanted to return to her is unclear, but certainly there appears to have been some connection. The cemetery proved to be a necropolis or city of the dead, that's just Greek for city of the dead, used by different classes throughout its lifetime, from the 2nd century BC approximately through the 5th and 6th, 2nd century AD through the 5th to 6th centuries AD. And over time, the interments gradually shifted from elaborate cremation burials to those simpler inhumation burials like the girl and the dog. And as the status of the city decreases over time, you would say lower status inhabitants of Carthage started to use the cemetery for their burials, which is why we see this discrepancy between monumental tombs and cremation and inhumation inside of a tomb versus simple burial in the ground. Indeed, the evidence for the kind of aristocratic nature of this cemetery wasn't really recognized by us until the last day of our excavation there in 1998. And this has happened to me on 3 different occasions, where on the last day you make an important and major find that you have to basically sit on for the next 9 months before you can go back and analyze it. But we found an inscription outside one of the large tombs that finally confirmed the excavator's thesis that this had been at one point one of the highest status cemeteries in one of the most important cities of the southern Mediterranean. And the funerary inscription identified the tomb as belonging to the Roman governor in Africa, literally one of the most powerful men in the Roman Empire. Further excavations, I left after 2 seasons here, and further excavations have revealed more of the cemetery and further provided proof of kind of the long use of the cemetery over time. Other tombs have been excavated and identified, and it really does appear as though the 2nd century cemetery was an elite cemetery that slowly over time became a more popular cemetery, should we say. All right, so at this point, I knew I wanted to study mortuary patterns, funerary analysis, but I was asked by a former professor who had been a teacher to me as an undergrad to join them in Israel on an excavation in 1999, which coincided with my first year of grad school. And this particular excavation focused on a site located on one of the many tells throughout Israel. The tell was located and a tell, I'll describe what a tell is in just a moment, but it was located in the Upper Galilee, right on the border with Syria and Lebanon. So we're talking right near the Golan Heights, right here by the town of Kiryat Shmona. this was really, this would have been 1999. So this was my first and fortunately only experience of working in the middle of a conflict. When we arrived at the kibbutz where we were staying, we were immediately shown where the bomb shelters were, because Hamas and Israeli forces had been exchanging rocket fire in the weeks leading up to our arrival. And again, you can see here, Tel Kadesh is where we were working, and it is literally on the border of Israel and Lebanon and right near Syria. When we arrived at the kibbutz, we were shown where the bomb shelters were immediately, as I mentioned. And sure enough, 2 days later, the alarm went off on the kibbutz, warning of incoming rocket fire. And from our team, some people immediately ran to the shelters as they were instructed. Others were too afraid to leave their rooms. And some simply watched the reactions of the people on the kibbutz, who were nonplussed and literally continued about their day as if there was nothing wrong. After 5 minutes, the alarm ended and things returned to their regular pace. Slightly humorous, the group who ran to the bomb shelter came back very worked up because the bomb shelter had been locked and nobody unlocked it. So we learned to live with that situation. There were times, whenever the alarms went off on the kibbutz, you just kind of perked your ears up and continued on your way for the most part. When we were out in the field excavating, and we heard alarms or saw, which we did in several cases, rockets flying overhead in the direction of other parts of Israel or Lebanon, we called it a day and headed back to the kibbutz. This was certainly a dramatic and I don't know if I can use the word exciting, but intriguing excavation. So we were there to excavate the site of Tel Kadesh, and it's called Tel Kadesh because it's a tell, or a man-made mound upon which settlements are constructed, and it's located in the area of the ancient tribes of Kadesh. And clearly, the advantages of living on higher ground here are obvious. It's much easier to defend. Since different phases of tells are usually built immediately on top of one another, the reuse of buildings and the ever-increasing height of the tell makes it more useful as time goes on. Tel Kadesh, which you see here, was absolutely massive. Tells can be quite big, but even by tell standards, this one is huge, more than a half a mile across. The site was first mentioned in the book of Joshua in the Hebrew Bible Old Testament, Hebrew Bible / Old Testament. And it passed through Assyrian and Persian rule during the first millennium BC. The site has always been a border site, of course, today on the border of Israel, Lebanon, and to some extent Syria, and in the early periods with the Canaanites, in the later periods with the Phoenicians and the Persians. So the project directors were particularly interested to see how the tell had functioned as such a border settlement, and conducted initial field surveys in 1997 over this massive site. And I described briefly what a field survey looks like. Yeah, you can imagine what teams of 5 to 10, 19 and 20-year-olds must have looked like traipsing back and forth on this tell. I guess I would have been older at that time, when 24, 25-year-olds traipsing across this tell, trying to locate where it is that we wanted to excavate. Just lost my place, sorry. And we found enough evidence actually in 2 spots to sink 2 test trenches. And test trenches are small pits that you usually sink maybe 4 or 5 feet into the ground. They're never more than 2 or 3 feet across, just to see if your survey instincts are correct, that if you dig down, you come upon something. And test trenches fail as often, if not more so, than they're successful. But this time around, we were fantastically lucky in that both trenches came down on something important. One, surprisingly, on a room filled with intact vessels, which you can see here, kind of a domestic room filled with these vessels and other household goods that immediately, immediately dated this this room at any rate to the Hellenistic period around the 2nd century BC. And the other trench encountered some massive limestone blocks that supported the idea about 5 feet into the ground, 6 feet into the ground. The other trench encountered these massive blocks that supported the idea, our idea anyway, that a magnetometric survey should be carried out in this area. And what that is just a fancy word of saying basically survey that uses radio waves projected into the ground to help map what is underground. When these waves hit certain materials that they can't pass through, they bounce back up and ultimately draw a picture of those of that element, whatever it is. And in our case, as you can see here, what we discovered through the magnetometric survey was this 20,000 square foot structure, about 6-7 feet below the ground, some slightly deeper in some areas. A building this size could only be palatial or administrative in nature, and it was decided in 1999 to begin excavations to uncover the structure. One of the first discoveries was a room with 14 large amphorae. And here, the majority of them were surprisingly intact. And here you can see one of my colleagues, Scott, attempting to carefully remove the amphora that hadn't survived as well as the others. The Israeli Antiquity Authority actually allowed the project to send back the bottoms of 2 of the jars for residue analysis, and indisputable evidence of grain and wine came back. And clearly this was a storeroom. The amphora were found in the corner over here of this large space. And clearly this was a storeroom and a pretty huge one. There would have been enough grain in these vessels to produce approximately 150 loaves of bread each. So, you know, we're talking 14 times 150. I haven't bothered to do the math, but it's a lot of grain. The next discovery was a large room in which a cache of ceramic bullae, as these objects are known, or they're also called ceilings, were discovered. We recovered over 2,000 of these little objects, which are approximately no larger than a dime. They seem pretty unremarkable when you find them in situ, but they are some of the most interesting and fascinating finds that, that you could hope to encounter. They're called ceilings because they were once used to seal documents or scrolls. In their original form, these ceilings would have been applied to a knot on a string holding together a scroll as wet clay. They would have been these would have been clay, and this clay disc would have been pushed onto a knot on the string to bind, say, a scroll, and the scroll would have been maybe a contract, a bill of sale, etc. And, you know, someone would have taken then their signet ring and would have stamped that clay, the clay in order to identify it as theirs. So the fact that we had the presence of 2,000 of these suggests we had come into some type of archive room. And the fact that these had even remained until the present day, that these had existed for what turned out to be over 2,000 years, was due in large part to a fire that occurred in this archive room. And specifically, we found a very dense ash layer that suggested this building had caught fire at some point. And while the fire did damage to the massive damage to the archive room, so much so obviously that all of the documents were destroyed. However, the ceilings made of clay were baked in the heat of the fire and became quasi indestructible, surviving the 2,000 years there in the dirt and making them incredibly easy to recover, incredibly easy to to clean, and also to compare to other ceilings found in the Eastern Mediterranean to better understand communication and trade. Some of these signet ring stamps, for example, are known throughout the Levant, are known throughout the ancient Middle East, suggesting that we had here merchants who traveled to different parts of this region on a regular basis, making deals, establishing sales, etc. Here is a full, sorry, I forgot. Final phase of digging in the mid-2000s revealed an architecture and finds that suggested the building had been constructed even before the Hellenistic period, during the Persian period, so about 500 BC. And so it lasted for approximately 400 years, which is a very long time for an administrative building to exist. And here you just see a small detail of the reception area, the grand reception room, or you see that image of the reception room, kind of the entrance to this administrative complex. And you see also this detail of a floor in the reception room, which was stuccoed and plastered and very elaborately decorated. So this would have been a very important complex, which you see here in its size. This is that archive room in which the bullae, the ceilings were found. This is that storeroom in which the amphorae were found. And then you have this reception complex that I just showed a moment ago that was seems to have been lavishly decorated. And the current hypothesis is that the Persian period building belonged to well-connected officials from Tyre and Phoenicia, and that it functioned both as an agricultural depot and an impressive marker of territory. And here you see really the extent of that building, which is still not entirely unearthed. You see here at its edges these, walls that are running underground, but delineate the larger extent of the building itself. And here is Tel Kadesh with that Hellenistic that Hellenistic building from a different vantage point, just so you can get an idea of the landscape. The mere fact that this building functioned as an active and thriving administrative center for over 300 years speaks volumes to its importance in the region, even if it is unattested to in the literature. So we're going to switch gears then briefly. We've looked at Roman period materials. We've looked also at Hellenistic period materials. We're going to move even further back in time to the 6th millennium BC. So we're talking the 5000s BC. This is the Neolithic period, and we're moving to Turkey, southeastern Turkey specifically. If that name Kahramanmaraş looks familiar to anybody, recently that is one of the centers of the recent earthquake seismic activity that was so strong in southeastern Turkey recently and took so many lives. This site is located almost smack dab in the middle of that seismic zone. And it is, as I mentioned, excuse me, it is a Neolithic site, which makes it very different from some of the sites I've just shown you with their massive architectural structure, with their well-preserved buildings or parts of buildings. But this site in Turkey, as I mentioned, was called Domus Tepe. And Domus Tepe is just Turkish for Pig Hill. And this site itself is, like I said, from approximately the middle of the 6th millennium to just past the middle of the 5th millennium. So for about 1,200 years, it was a 20-hectare site, making it really the largest settlement in that region of southeastern Turkey and Syria, and making it one of the largest sites anywhere in that region, in the Western world, Middle Eastern world, of Neolithic sites ever. By the time I arrived for excavations in 1999, the occupation had been traced in a series of trenches across the site, providing some rich evidence for circular and rectangular buildings. And when I say rich evidence, I mean small indications. When in the Roman period, we're talking about large blocks. Here, we're talking about much smaller stones. We had discovered numerous ceramics that pointed to this being a Halaf period site. And the Halaf period, which is a time in the Neolithic, focused specifically around southeastern Turkey and Syria. This Halaf period is well known for its amazing pottery. Remember, we're talking the 6th millennium, and they're producing pottery like this, 8,000 years ago. And it really, this type of pottery doesn't really find its equal, it's arguable, until the classical Greeks really, or even the archaic Greeks really begin to perfect their pottery skills. But this is some, again, this is some more than 6,000 years prior to that. So it really is an amazing, really is amazing work done by a very old society. Two things distinguished this large site of Domus Tepe. One was a common occurrence that you see at many sites from this period. And unfortunately, I didn't have a good picture of it, but you can see a couple of images here. These stones in the top right that seem to form a ring. There's some a little bit lower down. This site was peppered with stoloi, which are basically granaries, circular granaries, where food and grains are kept up above ground and in an enclosed environment so that vermin, disease, bacteria, what have you, can't get in. And there are also these circular structures, or like elements, I should call them. They're hardly structures anymore. Also served as baking ovens. So some had the function of storage, others had the function of actual cooking. And most of the Halaf period settlements had several of these structures across their site, like I said, for protection and for cooking. And then you'll notice this face in the bottom right corner. We're going to come back to this person in a moment. The second thing that really characterized this site is probably one of the most fascinating and bizarre things I've ever encountered in an excavation. But it was approximately 9 to 10 foot deep pit that we affectionately called the death pit. I don't have a good photograph of it because there are no good photographs really of it that exist. I'll show you a kind of grainy one in a moment. But I just wanted to show you, this became the primary focus of our excavation. This approximately 6 foot wide, 8 foot, 9 foot deep pit that had the remnants of animal bones, human bones, and all types of flora, evidence for flora in there, it was really just a very, once we found that, a focus from all other parts of the site shifted away to examining this really spectacular assemblage. And here in the foreground, you see the death pit before it's been excavated. And here you see one of the few pictures of the death pit during its excavation. And this is really the second phase of the death pit. It appears to have had 4 phases. So the materials in the death pit appear to have been laid out in these 4 phases that seem to have lasted over a couple of days. So at the bottom layer, which was mostly almost 99% animal bone, it's thought that this was created by the remnants of a large ritual feast held by the settlement. And indeed, that's not uncommon in the Neolithic period for sites and settlements to show exactly this evidence of massive feasting. And there were signs throughout the rest of the site at Domus Tepe that people often took part in ritual feasting together. Cows and goat bones predominated throughout this layer, and the bottom layer actually had the remains of 8 total cattle, which would have been enough to feed approximately 2,000 people, which is approximately the number of people you'd expect to be living on this 20-hectare site. So that's a lot of people for a 6th millennia site. The second layer was the rather surprising layer, if you will, which comprised the disarticulated remains of approximately 40 individuals. And that's what you see here in the picture on the right. And it's, it's the case here that you have literally disarticulated bodies of at least, I think it's at least 36 individuals, but probably 40 that are their own specific layer, slightly mixed in with animal bones, but predominantly human bones. And what's a little bit disturbing is that these bones show the signs of cut marks consistent with ritual sacrifice of some sort and possible cannibalization. The bodies had been chopped up and the flesh had been scraped from the bone. Some of the bones showed obviously signs of having been cooked, and that's called, I think it's also probably called this in forensic fields, but in anthropology, archaeology, that's called pot polish. And some of the long bones had been split lengthwise, presumably to get at the bone marrow. Many of the skulls that you saw, one of them anyway in the center there, but many of the skulls from this death pit show evidence of blows to the side of the head, suggesting this was some sort of ritual practice. And then finally, after another deposition of ashen animal bones, which would indicate feasting again, bodies continued to be buried around the death pit. And remember, I told you to note that that face that we previously saw. There was a skull found around the death pit, not in the death pit, but literally at the edge of the death pit that belonged to a body found a little bit further away of a young woman, 16 to 18 years old. She had been struck in the head by something very, very hard on the other side of her skull, clearly, decapitated and then buried apart from her head. We don't know why. But the skull, which you see here, was actually reconstructed about 9 years ago to reveal the face of the young woman there. And clearly, obviously, this is a practice now that is becoming more and more common, but it's very rare still when you can put a face to your finds. This is one of those poignant instances. I just want to wrap up, and I'm totally running out of time, so I just want to make sure I wrap up quickly and leave Megan enough time. The final slide I wanted to show you is an ancient cemetery at Kenkriai near Corinth in Greece. And Corinth, you'll see Athens over here. Corinth, as you know, lies on two gulfs, the Gulf of Corinth over here, or it lies between 2 gulfs, I should say, and the Saronic Gulf over here. Near Corinth is the ancient town of Kenkriai, which you can see clearly located down here. It is on the Saronic Gulf. And it was set back from the ancient harbor, but the cemetery outside of the city walls was located on a bluff overlooking the Gulf and the harbor. And here you have an image of that harbor today and the port. Down here you can see an ancient building that extended out into the harbor, and the ancient port would have actually been back here. And the cemetery we're talking about, unfortunately, this isn't a great picture, but it's located over here. You see this hill slowly rising up. The cemetery is located over here overlooking the Gulf. It functioned at its peak in the early centuries AD, but was being used for burial and habitation as late as the 6th and 7th centuries. During the region's prosperous period in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the cemetery was used by elite families to bury their dead in large underground chamber tombs that were elaborately decorated and combined both the practices of inhumation and cremation. And you can see here how tombs were built directly into the hillside. And this isn't a great picture, but were accessed through these shafts and via a set of stairs to underground tombs. The tombs themselves are really impressive structures. They measure anywhere from 3.7 by 3 by 3 meters to 2. They measure anywhere from 3 by 7 to 3 by 3 meters and 2.5 meters high. At some of the entrances of the tombs, there is an epitaph revealing when the tomb was first constructed, who constructed it, and who was interred therein. And within the tomb, the walls were generally finished in white stucco or painted plaster. And these tombs were used anywhere between 4 to 8 generations, and oftentimes held as many as 12 to 15 individuals. Their peak really in the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. And you can see these are, again, cremation. You have cremation spaces for cremation urns at the top, and then you have these loculi, as they're called, for inhumation burials, where you could have placed a body. You could have placed 2 bodies, as a matter of fact, one in the gap here, which you would then cover to place another one on top. And it does appear at this cemetery as though those who were cremated were likely of a lower status, but still somehow connected to the family than those in the loculi. The burials, let's see, I mentioned that. And here you have on the left, you have an idea of what this kind of burial mound would have looked like. So those shafts that are now on the hillside exposed would have actually been covered by a large monument with a doorway that then would have led you to that shaft, and those stairs you would have walked down into an underground tomb. And here is where you would have seen the remains of your family, the deceased from your family. And you notice this small altar here, which is also visible slightly in this tomb over here. These altars were often used, again, for ritual food preparation and meal preparation. There was also a massive, I'm going to skip a little because I'm running behind, but there's also a massive funerary monument that stood in the cemetery from the early 2nd century on. You can see it here. It's been deconstructed. Parts of this monument have actually been found in sections of the 5th century city wall, which was built 300 years after this monument. And that provides some of the best evidence of how this cemetery continued in use long after people stopped building new tombs there. And the elite tombs really point to a society that was able to enrich itself during Corinth's rebirth under Roman rule. And when you look at the location of the cemetery alone, it's hard to dispute the notion that this cemetery was a display of status and wealth on the part of dozens of families, and to a lesser extent those with more moderate burials here. Consider again that this is the view from the cemetery. It overlooks a really busy trading harbor of maritime traffic. Merchants, officials, and really anyone arriving at Kenkreai by way of its port had to look up from their ship at some point to see almost 200 diverse burials and monuments covering the hill overlooking their destination. And that's exactly what these families would have wanted, after all. Acknowledgement in death means that you weren't truly dead in antiquity. And it should also be noted that the dead would have enjoyed the heck out of this view as well. This is the view we had every day while we were digging, and you'll quickly understand why a person might want to be laid here for the rest of eternity. Not to mention, as I had previously, that these tombs were destination spots on religious holidays, community spots. Families would come to the cemetery and share food and ritual with their deceased kin inside of the tombs, and then return outside to picnic and enjoy the sea. So it's no surprise then when we find some of these tombs painted with maritime themes. On the last day in 2007, one of the teams, again, the last day, right? One of the teams in a trench right along the modern day ridge, right down here, actually, kind of where this person's standing, to be honest with you, just outside, discovered this mosaic. And later excavations revealed that sometime in the 4th or 5th centuries, a small but elaborate villa had been built on the lower half of this ridge, presumably because of that attractive location and awesome view. Over time, as the hill eroded, the sea claimed much of the villa, but the excavations exposed 2 more floors and an assemblage of finds that have since been removed, conserved, and now displayed in the local museum of Corinth. In 2005, I was hired by the Getty and began working at the villa where the Getty has its antiquities collection. I had finished my MA and decided that as much as I enjoyed the excavation part of archaeology, I wasn't a very keen researcher when the time came to come back home and take stock of what had been found. I decided that my archaeology career was officially dead, and going forward, that I would like to return to the Mediterranean on a regular basis without having to get up at the crack of dawn to move rocks and dig holes. But I can happily say that I've never regretted my decision for 1 minute. And in the next breath, I'll say that these excavations were some of the most memorable and inspiring moments I'll ever have. So I owe world to the profession of archaeology. And with that, I would say thank you, and over to you, Megan.
Oh my goodness, that is going to be very difficult to follow. That was awesome. Surprisingly, there are many parallels in our discussion, even though our discussions are completely different. I was taking notes as you were talking to note some of those commonalities. It's going to be really interesting. I'm going to share my screen. And my discussion today is actually going to cover, let's make sure this is coming properly. There we go. Is that showing, Eva Marie? We can see that? Okay, great. I am going to discuss with you today some local excavation right here in the middle of Los Angeles, which is very bizarre. We kind of tend to think of those excavation sites where Eric took us, but we have a very unique site in Los Angeles that I was lucky enough to be a part of. In 2006, I had finished school in archaeology, and I knew that I wanted to be in the museum world, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And I somehow fell into volunteering, and it's a fantastic thing to do. But I found myself at the La Brea tar pits, and I volunteered at a very, very fortunate time. They had just made a huge discovery because LACMA, which is right next door, the LA County Museum of Art is right next door to the La Brea tar pits, had decided to build a parking lot. And they had a huge discovery, which had just begun when I had started volunteering. So what I'd like to do today is, before we get into that discovery, I will tell you a little bit about the history of what's called the Rancho La Brea, how it came to be, and then why the project that LACMA came upon and what was a part of my time there, why that was so significant to this museum. So Rancho La Brea is the backdrop to this amazing site. That's what the land is called. And it's a small section of Los Angeles on Wilshire Boulevard, which is called Miracle Mile. And there is a treasure trove of fossils there, Ice Age or Pleistocene fossils. So we are talking about 11,000 to 55,000 years ago. A lot of people come to the La Brea tar pits thinking they'll see dinosaurs, which is 60 million years ago. We're talking much more recent, so 11,000 to 55,000, still a ways away, but not quite the dinosaur era. So how did these fossils get here? Well, in this particular area, there are these heavy oil fractions underground, and they bubble up, as we see here in this photo, and create what's called asphaltum. And we actually see these bubbles a lot, as if you walk around the site today of the La Brea tar pits, you'll see these bubbles. It's actually methane coming to the surface. And this has bubbled up for tens of thousands of years, and the oil comes to the surface forming these pools. And they're at many different sections throughout Hancock Park, which has created these what we call tar pits. This site has been used for thousands of years by Native Americans. They would use the tar and asphaltum for teats or their boats that they would fish, and they would seal the bottom of those teats, or jugs and pottery. It was a natural resource for many people who used the land there. You may be familiar with that picture on the left there. That's usually what you drive by when you drive by the La Brea tar pits, is this picture of this mammoth caught in one of these tar pits that I have just described, and some other animals waiting nearby. And again, you can still see this is an active pit. So you will see that methane still kind of bubbling up to the surface. And there unfortunately are birds, many animals still get trapped in these pits. And the reason for that is because there's usually a covering of water that will go over the surface of these pits that trick animals. And so they don't know that they would actually get stuck. So they come down into the water thinking they can swim or get a drink, and then they get stuck. I already spoke about how the Native Americans used this land. In the 1800s. Excavations began, mainly for oil, obviously, to kind of tap that resource, but they started discovering bones. And these bones that they were discovering, they thought were just modern kind of animals that were just domestic stock, cattle, those types of things. So they really didn't pay any attention to those bones. Goodness knows what they probably threw away in those early excavations. But it wasn't until 1875 that a man named William Denton found a bone that completely changed the landscape. There was no way that this bone could have been a recent modern animal. And that bone was this here. This is a saber from a saber-toothed cat. And when that saber was found, it changed everything. They started to look at these deposits in these pits and say, there's something more here. And Denton actually published a paper about the importance of these pits and this area. So with that saber, they were able to say, this is something that these are animals that were here thousands of years ago. Specifically, the saber-toothed cat was an Ice Age Pleistocene era animal. So even though this bone changed the way that they looked at these pits and excavations, they still only kept larger bones. There's a term in the tar pits, they call it the sexier bones. Those are the big ones that draw attention, that people want to see. Those are the only things they kept in these early excavations. So unfortunately, our notes, our documentation is extremely limited from this time. But the largest collection that the La Brea tar pits has until the LACMA project in 2006 was from 1913 to 1915. And about 750,000 large plants and animals were found. Now, these plants and animals were being saved and documented, but a man named George C. Page came to the area, decided he really wanted to invest in these plants, these animals, these bones that were being found, and make sure that they were preserved properly. So George C. Page came along and opened up this museum in 1975, where they started construction, and it opened in 1977. And when I say museum, what I mean by that are basically observation decks where you could go and stand in like an outside area and overlook active excavation sites and down into these pits that they were excavating. There were around 100 pits in this area that were being excavated. Not all of them produced fossils, but the ones that they continued to excavate became these observation decks. So that's what you probably, if you went to these museums when they first opened, that's probably what you remember until the actual building of the La Brea tar pits was built. Now, if we go back a little bit, I just wanted to give you a little bit more about the area too. George Hancock, a man, was also quite involved with this area. He also recognized the importance of these fossils that were found, and he donated the park and the land. He was the last official land owner, and he donated that land to the LA County with the provision that it be preserved and these fossils be taken care of. And that's where they worked with George C. Page to make sure that this area was highlighted. Again, when you walk down Wilshire Boulevard, you do not expect to see an active excavation site that's producing Pleistocene era fossils. So it's pretty amazing. A typical La Brea deposit looks very different than what Eric just showed you. But there are some similarities, which I think is very funny. These pits are called death traps. So Eric just went over death pits, and we call these pits death traps because of the nature of how they occurred. I mentioned earlier that an animal would be attracted thinking that there was water, they'd come and get a drink, and they would get stuck. So an animal could get stuck in just a few inches of tar. These pits did not have to be deep, and they did not sink. These are some of the myths that surround the tar pits. They did not sink. They actually were just stuck and could not move in just a few inches of tar, which means that these animals died either of dehydration or from a predator that would hear the prey's calls. And when the animal would get stuck, they would call out, and a predator would hear those calls and come and think, lunch, yum, and try to get the trapped animal, and then they themselves would actually be trapped. So what we tend to have here are these death traps or carnivore traps, because 90% of the La Brea collection are carnivores, specifically for this purpose. They mostly travel in packs. And so if one hears a prey, the whole pack will come in and get stuck. So you get these jumbles of bones, just animal on top of animal on top of animal on top of animal, which makes it extremely difficult to excavate and extremely difficult to say that one bone is associated with another, meaning we can't say that they're all from one animal, which I find very interesting when you walk into the tar pits and any sort of display that you see. There may be as many animals there, different animals, as there are different bones. So you can't say that one is from one specific animal because of how they're found. You see in the picture on the left there, and that is a very, very typical display and deposit of animal bones. I think in that picture, you'll see a femur. There's a jaw right here. Let me see if I can see. There's a jaw right here. Looks like there's a rib sticking out right here. So it's very, very difficult to find articulated items, and again, to be able to identify one entire animal. And they tend to be conical in shape. So when you dig out, or when you have an entire jumble like this, it's usually in a cone. On the right here is another wonderful example of a display and how those bones are discovered in these pits. Let's see. So the other thing I kind of wanted to go over is you'd notice in that saber Let me go back and see if I can show it here. You'll notice that the upper half of that saber is the gorgeous La Brea brown. And this is known and recognized actually worldwide. And chances are, if you go to another museum and see a brown bone, it is most likely from the La Brea tar pits. Because of this unique site, what happens is when the bones are in the tar, the tar is an excellent preserver. It seeps into the bones, and lighter fractions of petroleum come out and are released. They evaporate, and it leaves something very, very solid, and it colors it that very beautiful brown color. So in this saber in particular, half of it was buried and half of it was exposed. Just based on the color that we see, we can tell how that was found in a pit. And again, that La Brea brown color is famous. It is recognized around the world, and that tar actually preserves things that we don't normally see, which is our organic material, wood, plants, seeds, dust, pollen, very, very, very important things that were collected later on in excavations. Not in the early excavations. Again, those only the big bones were kept, but those things like the smaller bones and all of that organic material that I just mentioned paints a picture for researchers of what this area was like in the late Pleistocene and era. So those things are extremely important to tell us about weather, to tell us the animals that actually lived in this area, not the ones that just passed through and died here, which is what happened for the majority of the animals that you see at the La Brea tar pits. The saber-toothed cat, the dire wolf, the Columbian mammoth, the sloths were passing through and got trapped. So those younger or the smaller bones are really, really what's important to tell us about this specific area and what was going on thousands of years ago. Let's go through. I showed you that lovely deposit. So we come to Project 23. And in 2006, just like Eric mentioned, a bulldozer was going through the area right here where you see P23. And ended up taking off the top of a Columbian mammoth skull. And the minute that happened, the excavation or the construction, I should say, stopped. Excavation was not happening at that point, but the construction of this parking lot that LACMA was putting together here stopped. And they brought in some professionals from nearby Rancho La Brea here to say, what do we have here? What have we found? This is clearly something significant. Now, this Columbian mammoth was the first mammoth that was found since 1916. So it was extremely important and ended up starting this massive, massive excavation that LACMA did not like and did not have time for, to be honest. They needed to get their parking structure built. And that meant that the people, the excavators from the tar pits had to be very creative in how they were going to preserve these fossils and get them out of the way so that LACMA could continue to build their parking lot. And they kind of became very, very creative. Because LACMA was not going to give them the time to figure that out. So we ended up having mobile deposits, which meant that these large jumbles, those deposits that I showed you earlier that tended to be large and all together, they were completely dug out of the ground. They tried to estimate how big these deposits would be, dug them out of the ground, and put them in giant tree boxes. And so we have above ground excavation sites, which is very, very different and unique and unusual. And excavators found themselves climbing these huge, huge boxes and going inside an excavation site. It ended up being 16 different deposits, but some of them were so large, they were split up. So we had 23 tree boxes, thus giving the name Project 23. Very creative. No one could have come up with that name. And these boxes actually allowed the excavators the time that they needed to make sure that we could properly document, measure, and prepare these fossils. So with this particular project, preservation was very unique as well. So when I talk about preservation, what I mean is actually the state of the fossils or piece that we're finding, the condition that it's in. And tar can preserve, as I mentioned earlier, these specimens extremely well. But we found that at some point, this excavation site, or these big deposits had actually gone through water. So we found really unique things that we don't normally find, and that also changed the condition of the dirt, or what we call matrix, that surrounds the fossils and the bones. So some of it would be extremely hard, really, really difficult to dig through, just like you would imagine tar or asphalt to be. And other parts would be clay-like and almost disintegrate the minute you put your dental pick into it. It was incredible to find such a difference, and sometimes within one tree box. It was really, really unique, and definitely painted a picture of the area. Again, what happened weather-wise. We could kind of look at all of those differences and try to determine what had happened at different times through the years. Let me see here, make sure I'm hitting everything. So some of the finds, again, that we had in this project were so unique, things that you don't normally find, or at least we didn't have documentation of, because a lot of the things were not properly documented in the early 1900s when most of those excavations were being conducted. So at this time, we now had the ability to measure, to record, and really, really kind of compare with the time frame, with the proper documentation, and create a much more complete picture of this time because of this LACMA excavation. So things we found that we don't normally find are a juvenile mastodon, which you see here, kind of taped together. You can see the teeth here, and this would have been taped together to prepare for well, I would say display, but now knowing what I know, most of these items did not go on display. They are kept in the lab for research and for further kind of look at further. But this particular piece, which is really, really fascinating, this juvenile, which we rarely find young specimens. This was, you can see, taped together and glued, and we don't normally do that. We don't normally tape pieces together, again, because we cannot say that pieces are of the same animal. So when we conduct our excavations, we tend to put all femurs in one kind of drawer. We put all skulls in one drawer of the same animal, but we do not put pieces together because we can't say that it's from the same animal. And this in particular, we could say, wow, this is a juvenile. We know we don't have many of these. So we were able to kind of piece together a little bit of this juvenile mastodon, which was really, really fun. And in the surrounding matrix, in the dirt, the things that would have been thrown away earlier, we found also fascinating things like these talons. These are 3 different talons from predatory birds. So you can see the different sizes. And those, again, tell us about the animals that actually lived in this area in at 11,000 to 5,000 years ago. So our process, which was finally actually a complete one for this area, we would take the matrix, we would take these buckets of dirt that we found around the bones in all the different tree boxes and separate them. So we have plants, On one side, we have tiny, tiny fragments of bones. We have insects and bugs in another pile, seeds, rocks, and this would actually be what a typical pile looks like, that you would take a tiny, tiny paintbrush and kind of go through and find all those different categories and sort them into the piles. This tiny pile could be what you worked on for a very long time. So you had to have a lot of patience, clearly, and make sure that you were documenting things properly. We'd use those pill, kind of clear pill, not boxes, but pills here that I think they're, what are they called? The like just dissolvable ones that you could normally fill with something else, but we would use those for each tiny little specimen. So again, everything was very, very well documented, unlike it had ever been before. This is a box of shells in the middle here, again, telling us so much about this project, and that at some point it was underwater. And so we would take these shells and they're little mollusks, and put them kind of all together in a box here. And this one, gosh, I can't see because of my screen there, but this one is one of those dissolvable pills that I was talking about. And inside is the tiny red right pelvic spine of a snake. So that tells you the size of things we were finding, and that we were documenting every single thing. That would have probably been a part of this little bone pile over here on the left. Every little thing got a number, was documented. And again, these are almost more important than those big animals. This tiny bone of a snake tells us so much about the animals that were able to thrive and live in this area. Which brings me to the big deal, Zed. This is what I worked on. I was considered primary on Zed. Zed was the Columbian mammoth that started this project. His skull was the one that you saw, or that I told you about, that was taken, the top was taken off by a bulldozer. Zed was a very, very big deal, again, because it was the first Columbian mammoth that was found in a very, very long time. And he was 75 to 80% complete. And what also made him really, really unique was he was articulated, basically. Again, in a site that you don't find that, this was really, really different. So here's a picture of how he was found. And instead of Zed getting a tree box, we took the larger bones of Zed and plaster jacketed them on site. So we had a process to conserve these bones that contained, keeping the matrix, obviously, which I just explained why that was so important, keeping all of that intact, and not doing any sort of work on him in the field, getting as much of the bone and the surrounding matrix that we could, putting some newspaper over it, and then putting plaster over that, and taking these large plaster jackets back to the lab, and they would be opened at a later time. So again, the whole point of this project, we didn't have time. We had no time. LACMA wasn't going to give us that. So we had to come up with these creative ways to preserve these bones on this site as quickly as possible. And this was the way that we dealt with Zed. And his name was Zed. I don't know if I mentioned this. His name was Zed because he basically we started from zero with him. He was resetting a lot of our thoughts and ideas about this area and about this site. So he was named Zed, and thankfully, we gave him a proper name, and I'll tell you how we know that in a minute. But here's his actual site. This was how he was found. Again, almost articulated, which is extremely rare. So we had this site, and we were able to measure and kind of find out a lot about him and what his journey was, again, based on the matrix and what was around him. So here, I'll just point out some of the bones that we'll see later are the tusks. Tusks are dentine, rarely survive. So the fact that we had these are the first pair of tusks, I believe, at Rancho La Brea that were discovered. So this was extremely important and very, very fragile. We had the skull, which was destroyed by that bulldozer, lower jaw, both scapula, the some vertebra, the pelvis, and ribs, femurs, humerus. We had most of him, and I worked on most of him. The jaw, his lower jaw, was what I spent the majority of my time on. And the reason for that, we chose the jaw to open first. That was our first plaster jacket of Zed, was because the jaw tells us age, it tells us sex, and it tells us a lot about some pathology of maybe what makes Zed so unique. So I mentioned we named him Zed. It's kind of more of a male name, and he was in fact male. We were able to determine that from his jaw. He was around 55 when he died. So he was a bit on the older side for a mammoth. He had lived a good life. And the reason we can determine that is based on the teeth. So mammoths, much like I believe modern day elephants are pretty similar, but they have these blocks of teeth that erupt as they age, and they move forward and then they fall out. That's kind of the life of a mammoth. So a lot of mammoths, unfortunately, could probably live longer, but they don't have teeth left. So a lot of their teeth will move forward and fall out, and they die of starvation. But we could tell based on the teeth that Zed had left to erupt how old he was. So we knew just based on that he was around 55. I worked on this jaw for about 3 months with a lot of those simple tools that every archaeologist talks about: dental picks, hammers, chisels, dental drills, flat spoons. And he was in pretty good shape, thankfully. There was not a lot of, he wasn't too fragile. He's that beautiful La Brea brown. And he didn't disintegrate. Some of the bones would actually disintegrate because of their exposure, and the matrix around them did not protect them as other pieces. So what we have here is a really well-preserved jaw with some very interesting pathology in the front, which is where my arrow is pointing. This bizarre formation on his jaw, we could tell probably caused his mouth to be open, and he probably drooled, which is poor Zed. But he had some definitely interesting marks that made him unique, and that was one of them. Once he was all clean and the matrix was off of him, we sorted that later, but we coated him, we cleaned him with linium, which is basically like another version of a nail polish remover. We cleaned him completely. That La Brea brown never comes off no matter what you use. And then we sealed him with PVA, which is just a glue, to make sure that he stayed in really, really good shape. On a side note, my background in history has a lot to do with conservation. And you're going to hear different terms. You're going to hear restoration or conservation. And restoration is something that is practiced when you have a piece that perhaps is incomplete, but you want to present a full and complete work, whether that's an artifact like a piece of pottery or a mosaic, or even some bones here. We could actually try to fill in areas and restore this to what it would have looked like. When you start talking about restoration with art, you're talking about changing it perhaps by adding those things that are missing. So restoration isn't something that normally the Getty practices, or a lot of museums practice actually, because that changes what the original artist may have intended. When you talk about restoration with bones or paleontology like this, we kind of know what a skeleton would look like, so we can fill it in for you without changing that too much. But that does differ a bit with art. But we really concentrated on conservation here. Again, so conservation is just about kind of taking care of what's left and trying to make sure that that is as clean as possible, gets it back to its original state, but we're not adding anything to change intention or perhaps how you view it. So my conservation knowledge, I think that's why I was initially brought on this project, actually, was to help conserve these bones and take care of them as well as I could. So we use things like the PVA, which everything's reversible in conservation. You never do anything that will permanently damage or change an object. So even in art, when you do conservation, all techniques that are used are reversible. So that later on, if techniques or thoughts, theories change, which they always do, you have reversible techniques that don't damage the actual artifact or piece. So here's the skull, the famous Zed skull, which has remained in this jacket. I'll show you a photo at the end of this lecture to show you, which I actually have to speed along here. I didn't realize how late we were. Sorry, Eva Marie. The skull, since it was completely destroyed, what we're looking at is kind of the back of the jaw here. And this would be like where the cheekbone is on the side here, right here. And you're looking kind of up at the top of the jaw, those upper teeth, and then the top of the back of the skull here, and the top is in the bottom of this jacket. That never has been opened, really, because it's so damaged that there's nothing to see there. So they've actually only excavated this halfway inside the lab of the museum, and you'll only see about this about halfway complete. This is a really interesting thing that can happen with La Brea bones, and one of the things you have to be careful with when you're working on conservation, specifically with this type of matrix and site, is these bones, because the asphalt is what's preserved it and what has kept it the way it is, it's actually can kind of reawaken and come back to life. So if you use too much of the linium, for instance, it will go in and it'll reawaken the tar, and it'll just start oozing out. And then you've got more work on your hands. It'll undo all the work that you just did. So that's what we see here. We see all of this kind of like spilling out of this piece. And sometimes it would just continue, no matter what you did. It was just active and would constantly spew tar. So we found that to be the case, specifically with the skull, that it would just constantly ooze. We have some of the shells and some of the matrix here. And here's a good example of the organic material and the wood that was found, which tells us about specific trees and plants that were here in the area thousands of years ago. Here's me working on the pelvis, just to give you a sense of scale. This is quite large. Mammoths are not small. And so I was working on this pelvis for quite a while. You can see this plaster jacket here, and you can see that the matrix on here is actually completely different than what we just saw with the skull. This is really clay-like, and I'm just using a brush here, and I'm just brushing it away. So our techniques and our conservation ideas would differ on every single piece that we opened. And so we had to approach every single thing differently. Some things we couldn't even clean because they would disintegrate. So we just poured PVA on them to protect them and to keep them intact. So that PVA covers the bone with the matrix on it. And so that was you'll find that, again, these pieces look completely different. They're all from a very, very same area, but because of the stream that one time probably took them and carried this site and made it mobile and kind of placed it where it was found, it changed pieces, it changed the conditions. It really was very interesting to open a piece and have no idea what you're going to see. We have no idea what condition the bone would be in when we would open it. I'll go quickly. We have the left and right humerus. Again, this one was beautiful and intact. I can just see the La Brea brown. I can tell it's very strong. This in the whiter color tells us there's permineralization and that it was exposed at some point to the elements and much more fragile. So these were in two completely different conditions. So this, again, because of these pieces and because how different they are, each one made it impossible to create a display of Zed. what you'll find today are, when you walk into the museum, you'll see the jaw out because it was so important and significant. But you'll find different pieces at different places throughout the museum, because there's no way that you could actually put this together and create a display out of it. It's A, too fragile, and B, looks completely different. Each piece looks so different. This was one of my more interesting finds. We see a rib behind Zed's here. This is actually an Asian elephant that we used for comparison while we were opening jackets. This was an Asian elephant named Jenny, who came to us from the San Diego Zoo. And Asian elephants are the closest relatives of Columbian mammoths, so we were using this skeleton to compare and to see the pathology of Zed in particular. And this one rib of Zed's was very, very interesting. We can see that he had some injury at some point. We see this major kind of huge blow here. And we do know that it did happen while he was alive because it had healed. But it creates this very funny kind of lump and nodule, like bizarre little formation on his rib here that tells us he was in some sort of fight. Something happened to poor Zed. Here are the tusks. Now, the tusks were the last thing that were opened in this excavation. It was what everybody wanted to see because, again, tusks don't survive. And we were very curious about the condition of these tusks. But we really didn't open them. We opened this one little section. We cut out this kind of square here to check the dentine to look and to see how it looked. But it was decided that it was way too fragile to actually continue to open the jacket. So what you see today is this in the museum. This is, they only opened the top of this tusk to really show you what it looked like. But the bottom is completely still stable in that jacket. And then this tusk was not opened at all. It was determined that there wasn't enough, it wasn't strong enough. So they created a display out of it. Why not? And to show that this is what Project 23, the process of Project 23, and how the jackets looked once they came out of the site. So they kind of keep it to just talk about the site as an active excavation. I sort of rushed. Sorry, I didn't realize we were that over time. This is the current lab of the tar pits. You can see in the background there, that's the skull still there. They will not open it. And again, these pieces are scattered throughout the museum for you to see and to learn more about Project 23 and La Brea. These are my two kids there who absolutely love this museum and love to see what's on display and what's left of Zed and this project. So sorry, Ava Marie, I kind of went over, took some time.
No problem, no problem. First of all, thank you. What a great, interesting look that we got into this world of archaeology. And we do have some questions that students, so students, if you want to just start putting questions, that's great. I know I have tons, but let's start. So first off, we have a student who asked, does DNA exist in the La Brea tar pit bones? Are they able to get DNA?
That is such an excellent question. It's something that has plagued the site. No, unfortunately, because of the way that DNA is extracted from bones, there's a certain amount of DNA that's actually evaporates per year. It's kind of like done on a scale that you can really time, and that's how you actually date pieces, is based on all of that. But this time period it far exceeds, and so all of that, the DNA has actually come out and we don't have any. It's an excellent question.
Excellent. And then Eric, a question for you that also came in. I know you had touched upon this a little bit, but they it's asked, were skeletons examined for health indicators? I mean, you mentioned the girl and her treatment, unfortunately, but yeah, were skeletons examined for health indicators?
Yeah, most certainly. That's a very common practice with any
recovery of osteological material, whether it's, human or faunal. And it's certainly the case that that kind of information gives us a really good idea of, the demographic, the health demographic, if you will, of the surrounding population. So one of the, excuse me, one of the burials at the Carthage cemetery, for example, was of an older man who had passed away. Yeah, an older man who had passed away, and it was clear he had broken his leg at some point early in his lifetime. And not unlike that little dog who formed its own socket in its pelvis, this leg grew differently, but basically healed itself. And then certainly, another area to look at is the dentition. That's an important component too, as well as bones, to talk about the relative health of a population. But some diseases really leave a lot of traces of their having occurred, and if those are spotted in populations, then they're investigated more closely. But yeah, generally, any bone that doesn't look, let's say, that doesn't look 100% like it should, is usually, or if you get enough of them, let's say, is usually studied in that regard.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And now to you, Megan. So I have a question. Why did LACMA build so close? I mean, there had to have been a point, and do you know about the history of why they were so close? And then the follow-up would be, do they find, well, probably not, because I know Wilshire is pretty built up, but were other parts of Wilshire, that area outside of what we know today of the La Brea tar pits, have these tar pits?
That's such a good question. So your first question about LACMA building so close, I don't know why. I do know that they are limited as far as where they can put their, parking at that time. And as Eric kind of touched on, in this particular area, it doesn't really matter where you dig, you're probably going to find something. And so that's, archaeology, that's in this case, paleontology for this area, because of all of those pits and that the natural resources and these natural things that are occurring just in this specific area. What is interesting is a lot of the pits don't yield fossils, as I kind of touched on in the beginning of my talk, but the tar is a nuisance. And if you know anyone, or if you've ever lived at Park La Brea, you will hear constant complaints about tar in pipes, about tar disrupting fire hydrants. It is still active, it is still oozing, and it is still causing issues. So it is definitely underground a lot in this area, but it did not form the pits that you see specifically in that one little area on Wilshire. But around, in a greater kind of circle, tar is a big problem in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember as a little girl having, you're running through the park when they had those observation decks before the museum, you could get tar in your shoes. Yeah. And then your mother would yell at you because you got tar in your clothes because you're playing in the grass.
Yeah, so as the earth shifts, I mean, which happens constantly, the tar will make its way to the surface and will kind of bubble up, and it'll happen quite quickly. So I think today La Brea has a very quick, easy try to fix for that, which is just put a yellow cone by it and hope that no one steps in it, because it'll bubble up so fast you can't really control it, and you don't know when or where that's going to happen in the area. But you'll often find, just walking through the streets, pipes that have burst because of the tar that's broken it, or issues. I used to see all the time things kind of blocked off because tar had come up through and created a sticky situation.
Excellent. And so now for you, Eric, one thing you had mentioned, and you had said this word twice, and that's lucky. How much in the field of archaeology does that really come to fruition? Because you had mentioned that with the test trenches and then luck. I mean, how much is, the research, how much is that luck? I guess, you think of like Indiana Jones and it all goes so nicely, but you've shown us today, no. So how much is luck versus research?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I would answer that is, let's say in the planning stages, you don't want to let anything come down to luck. I mean, if you, especially if you're a classical archaeologist who's excavating overseas, you better have a proposal for that country's government that basically eliminates the need for luck, or any such, such type of element. Yeah, I mean, it has to be, it has to be, and archaeology is very much a science, so it has to be grounded in science, in the rules of science, and in the methods of science. It is the case that you try to remove any aspect of luck as much as you can. That said, it is as simple as like, planting your shovel, 2 feet away from where you could have planted your shovel and missing out on something one season that, you might find next season, or maybe not at all. So there is some element of it. I mean, it is, you are still looking for things that are quote unquote lost. And, more often than not, that element is kind of like the test trenches. Yes, it was lucky that both of them revealed something important, but by the same token, that the surveys that had taken place there previously made the possibility of those test trenches revealing something important higher. And I think ultimately that's because it can't be an exact science, even though it's grounded in the rules of science. That's what you're going for in archaeology, is the highest probability possible. So maybe I should stop using the word lucky and start thinking about referring to it in terms of probability.
Well, it just sounds more scientific.
Yes, that too.
But real quickly, I know we've gone a little over, so just one last question, Eric, because you mentioned a big part, and I say this especially in the climate we are in, with repatriation, the returning, and all that. How much of a role does the local, and then even probably the national government, play in excavations, archaeological digs overseas?
Yeah, it really depends on which country you're talking about. A country like Turkey, for example, there's federal oversight as well as regional, so that every excavation in Turkey and I think I was going to say that is carried out by non-Turks, but I think it may be even the case that even if you're Turkish, that project is accompanied by a government official who stays with the project the entire time of the project, literally living with the project, goes to the site every day, observes what's happening, and basically acts as a monitor. In Greece, for example, you don't have necessarily that level of oversight. You have both federal and regional government officials who are familiar with your work and can drop in at the drop of a hat, come anytime they want. But are less inclined to maybe stay with the project throughout the entirety of its excavation. The reasons for that are very clear. The governments want to be certain that everything is on the up and up. Oftentimes, these officials are students of archaeology themselves who might be in graduate school or might have finished graduate school, and instead of becoming archaeologists have become these officials. So there are times even where they're helpful because of their knowledge, potentially of the area or of excavation practices. So, but I mean, if you are a foreigner working in any one of these countries, you have to have some contact with the government at a federal, regional level, especially if you want to remove any materials for further analysis. Then it becomes very it becomes a very convoluted, very kind of intensive contact with the government.
Excellent. Well, again, Eric and Megan, thank you so much for being our guest lecturers today. And again, students, you're welcome to continue the dialogue through the discussion board on Canvas, and also send me your impression and thoughts, which will open up in 5 minutes. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great week. Very fascinating. And now I want to go dig something. I don't know what. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great
Thank you.
week.
Thanks, Ava Marie.
My pleasure.